So we tend to deal with emotions in a variety of different ways, often depending on, who we are and how we've been brought up. So we certainly have parents who really talk about kids' feelings, but we also have parents who unknowingly, they say, there, don't worry, there's nothing to worry about. And the message that gives to kids is, my emotions aren't important signals, or they're things to be sort of brushed under the carpet.
Welcome to Tilt Parenting, a podcast featuring interviews and conversations aimed at inspiring, informing, and supporting parents raising differently wired kids. I'm happy to be bringing you an important conversation for our current moment. I'm talking to the author of the new book, When the World Feels Like a Scary Place, Essential Conversations for Anxious Parents and Worried Kids. And it seems like it's the exact right book for this exact time in the world. I wanted to have a very practical and helpful conversation about how to handle those sometimes difficult but important conversations we are all no doubt having more than usual right now, or are perhaps wanting to have with our kids, but we don't know where to start or what to say. Because we as parents and caregivers often have our own emotions and anxiety surrounding scary, uncertain, and unsettling current events, making it really difficult to know how to both broach and be in those conversations with our kids. That's why I'm happy to bring to the show Dr. Abigail Gewirtz, a child psychologist, mother of 4, and a leading expert on families under stress. Abigail is also a professor in the Department of Family Social Science and the Institute of Child Development at the University of Minnesota, where she has devoted her career to developing and testing award-winning skills-based parenting programs that promote children's resilience. I was able to preview a copy of Abigail's book, and I can tell you it is truly full of examples of essential conversations, as in actual scripts with dialogue, talking points, and prompts that are age-appropriate and centered around different issues. In our conversation, Dr. Gewirtz explains the reasons why it's essential to have these conversations, how to make sure your own anxiety doesn't get in the way, and what simple thing to do each day to facilitate more open and thoughtful conversations with our kids. And now, here is my conversation with Dr. Gewirtz. Hello, Abby. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Debbie. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, your book kind of landed in my lap at the perfect time. And, your book is published through Workman as well, which is who did Differently Wired. And so I know your publicist, and she sent me a note, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is the book that all parents need right now. So I'm so excited to get into all of it. And before we do that, I always ask my guests to just take a minute to do their own introduction. I've already read your formal bio, but just take a few minutes to introduce yourself and what you do in the world.
Thank you, Debbie. Well, I am a mom of 4. My kids are older. My youngest is 17 years old. My oldest is 26. It's hard to even say that. But like every other parent, my husband and I gave birth, and no one had told us what to do. I happen to have a professional advantage, which was that I was a psychologist by training, but that conferred no personal advantage in bringing up our kids. And it was a thrilling, it still is a thrilling and exciting ride, and sometimes an impossible ride. And it's really the best job I've ever had. And when in about the mid 2000s, 2015, 2016, I began to notice referrals to my private practice increase, specifically with anxious children and very anxious parents, I began to sort of look around and think about the state of the world, and I was doing more international work as well. And I looked at the numbers, and I just saw skyrocketing increases in anxiety and depression among kids, in teen suicides. And at the same time, the world seemed to be undergoing a really high degree of tumult. And you'll recall 2016, very divisive time at home and abroad, politically, with huge numbers of migration at a scale not seen since World War II, horrendous school shootings in the beginning of lockdown drills in school, and then increasing awareness of climate change and that existential threat. And I began to think, my goodness, my kids were out of diapers by then. They were all beginning to be in their teens. And I just wondered how it would be to be a parent of a young child then. And that's when I decided to write the book in late 2016. So it wasn't a book that I started thinking about just when the pandemic hit, but boy, it was hard to think that things could unravel more, and they have. So I'm very glad that I could write this book.
Yeah, again, it's so practical and covers so many issues, and including the pandemic. You know, the book, as we're recording this, comes out tomorrow. So I love that you were able to address that, because I think this year has been a rough one. I know it's been a rough one, and it's been very confronting and really challenging parents to kind of up their game, and we need tools. So I wanted to actually just start by asking you about our role as parents in shaping our kids' point of view. So, you know, you talk about this in the book. We are kind of their first exposure to difficult subjects, and the way that we talk to them is going to shape the way that they think about all the issues that are so important and divisive. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, the importance of us having these conversations, and are there right versus wrong conversations to have?
Right. I would argue that parents are their kids' first and best teachers. And we knowingly, intentionally, or unintentionally shape the way our children not only think about things, but really engage with the world. Most of us do it unintentionally. I think parenting can be so overwhelming that just making your way through every day is a significant accomplishment. To be intentional about the values that you want to transmit to your kids is another level still. And I certainly, as a parent of young children, just focused on the survival. I mean, I had 4 kids under the age of 9. And it was just organizationally, it was a huge struggle with 2 working parents, 4 young children, and just juggling everything. So in the book, I urge parents to do a simple exercise that helps them think about what it is they want to transmit to their children. And it's just a really brief exercise that encourages parents to think into the future and think about how their children talk about what their parents have taught them. So how do we teach our kids? Well, we teach our kids through thousands, tens of thousands of conversations that we have every day that mostly we don't plan, that sometimes are sparked by our children bringing something or by our children's reactions to something, and sometimes they're sparked by us. And they occur over the dinner table, or they occur when we're helping them with their bedtime or morning routine, and sometimes they're at the bus stop, and sometimes they're in the car, and they're in lots of different places. And I argue that most conversations are conversations that parents would want to have, because if we think about how we want our children to learn about the world, wouldn't we rather they learn it from us than from the school bus or their friends parents or their teachers or other adults? And certainly there are huge contributions that other adults can make to our children's growing up. But if it's an important issue, I would argue that it's really something that we parents want to talk about with our kids, preferably first.
So it sounds like being kind of ready to seize on moments. What I heard you say is that many of these are unplanned, which I agree with. I think I used to think that I would have these, we're going to have this talk right now, and this very kind of Brady moment where we'll sit down, or an after school special moment, and let's discuss this. But really it is about being prepared when things come up, right? A little mention of something that was said at school, or our child brings something up at the dinner table, like you said. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Often it's not our dance to lead. It's our dance to follow or to match our child's footsteps. And we want to be really careful not to be intrusive in the way that we have conversations with our kids. And often parents find that when they are available, when their children want to talk, that's a much more powerful opportunity for a conversation than when we choose and we try and force the issue.
And also, again, that you said this is many, 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 many conversations. It's not a once and done kind of thing. This is ongoing, especially, the audience for this podcast, which is differently wired kids who often, whether they're gifted or they are very strong-willed or maybe a little less flexible in their thinking, they often require a lot more evidence to think about things than a neurotypical kid.
That's right. That's right. And in the book, what I urge parents to do, and I imagine that many of the listeners of your podcast do far more than this, but I urge parents just to take 10 minutes a day to have an essential conversation. And it doesn't even, it mostly might not even feel like an essential conversation. But the reason I suggest that is because I was shocked when I looked at the results of the American Time Use Survey, which ask parents and people how they use their time. And one category of time use is talking with children. And what I found that was so shocking was that 80% of parents didn't even list talking with children as a category by which they spent their time. And I'm sure that's not because they don't say anything to their children, but it's because mostly you're talking with your kids when you're trying to get them to eat or to school or to other, get ready for bed and things like that. But the good news was that of the 20% who did report time spent talking with their children, they reported more than half an hour a day. However, on average, that comes to 3 minutes a day across the population of parents. And I think if everyone took just 10 minutes for an essential conversation, maybe not when you're doing something else primarily, we might find that we're getting better at it. We're more able to respond to our kids' strong negative emotions or, intense urgency around an issue that's causing them distress, for example.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Well, I want to get into some of the essential conversations, especially bearing in mind what's happening in the world as we're recording this. And before we do that, could you just spend a few minutes talking about what our goals are in having these conversations, maybe thinking about the different ages of our kids? So what would our goal be in having conversations about difficult subjects with our younger kids versus our teenagers?
Right. So our ultimate goal would be to help our children ultimately. So maybe this is a mission and not a goal, but ultimately to help our children grow up to be engaged, confident, and compassionate human beings. And of course, that's a massive, really a big goal. And of course, that can be broken down into multiple small steps. But the reason I mention it is because the small steps that we need to take in every individual essential conversation, that's the term I use for these conversations about difficult issues like climate change or violence or social justice or divided society, is that we need to be able to understand how this issue affects us, parents. Because what we want to do in this conversation is listen to our children and our children's concerns and not have them be clouded by our own worries and our own preoccupations with the issue. So the first thing we need to be able to do is sort of respond to our own emotions about the issue so that when we're sitting with our kids, we're truly able to hear them, to listen to them, to hear what are truly their concerns, which aren't necessarily the things that we think they're worried about, and then to respond to those concerns in a way that empowers our kids. So, for example, using a problem-solving process whereby together we would brainstorm solutions for whatever the issue is, whether it is your child's worry about going back to school, for example, or whether your child's upset that he or she can't see his or her grandma because of COVID-19. And the idea would be then to conduct this have this conversation in a way and a place that enables you to really frame it very positively and have your child end up feeling that there are things that they can do rather than feeling overwhelmed and helpless, which is so easy for us to feel in the wake of these huge issues.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. I was just thinking about a conversation we had I have a 15-year-old son, talking the other night just about so much of what's going on. And we've been going out to protests and, living in New York City, which has been very shut down more than many cities from COVID-19. And it's just felt like a really hard time. And really it was about creating a space for him he really just wanted to share hard things, the hard feelings and how rough this is. And Like, I didn't try to put a positive spin on it too, because it didn't feel appropriate. I really just was empathizing in that moment. So is there, especially when you're dealing with older kids who may be more, it's maybe having more existential crises and thinking about these things and trying to make sense of it all. Is there a desire also to just hold a space for them and to kind of feel neutral or engaged without necessarily trying to solve some of these problems we know that we can't solve, right?
Well, I'm so glad you said the words positive spin, because I want to really make sure that what I was saying before was not that we need to put a positive spin on scary things at all. So I'm really glad you gave me the chance to clarify that. Actually, what you just said in terms of holding the emotions is really important. And so when we listen to our kids, what's most important is to acknowledge, identify, and validate how they're feeling. That's most important. Why? Because we want our children to understand and learn that their emotions are important signals. So by saying to our child, and I don't know whether you want to give a concrete example with your 15-year-old, we can use that, but when a child, for example, says, I'm really scared to go outside because I'm worried I might get coronavirus, a parent, the opportunity to focus on the way that child's feeling allows a parent to really validate that child. So I might say to that child, if it was my child, and when you feel scared, I can see that your eyes are wide and you look scared in your face, and I wonder how you feel scared in your body. Does your stomach have butterflies? Because I know when I get scared, I feel butterflies in my stomach. How about you? And I can see you look like you're kind of hot. So sometimes people's hands get sweaty when they get scared. And that gives the opportunity for your child to connect their feelings with the sensations they have inside their bodies, and later with the way they're thinking. I'm scared, and I don't want to go outside because I'm scared that I might get coronavirus. So that's the first real step when you listen to your child, to be able to identify and validate their emotions. And the problem solving, and actually, thank you also for raising the question about whether we need to problem solve all the time. Not at all. There are quite a few examples in the book where there's no problem solving. However, I do think it is important to end a conversation about a scary event with hope. Because when we get overwhelmed and we feel powerless, we can easily get sucked into a cycle of just feeling worse and worse, and feel so helpless. And the reality is that there are many things that we can't do anything about, but there's always something that we can do. And I think the power of instilling hope is that you show that wherever you are, there is always something, however small it is, that can be done. But the tricky thing is making a space for the emotions and not doing what, as parents, I think often we have the instinct to do, which is saying, they're there, things are going to be looking up, or it's not so bad as you think. So it's a tricky balance, Debbie.
Mm-hmm. And does it look different for different ages?
100%. So teenagers can tolerate more of this is really tricky, and they understand, and you can't pull the wool over their eyes. They want to talk about existential questions, and they can tolerate, they can understand more. But whereas with 3 to 5 year olds, you're going to have a much more concrete conversation. We can't see grandma because she is one of many people, or some people, who really can get very sick from the coronavirus. And so we don't want to give it to her by accident. But let's think about some of the things that we can do for grandma, right? So you've had this conversation, whereas with 15-year-olds, of course, it's far more nuanced and complex.
We'll be right back after this quick break. Maybe I've watched too many seasons of The Amazing Race, but every time I have to go somewhere on the subway, I treat it like a competition. It's all about making the right gut decisions about which route will get me there the fastest. Sometimes those decisions get me where I'm going early, and other times my gambles don't really pay off. Probiotics can't help with most gut decisions, but if your gut needs a little support, Ritual has your back. Their Symbiotic Plus, a 3-in-1 supplement, has clinically studied prebiotics, probiotics, and a postbiotic to support a balanced gut microbiome. I've been using Symbiotic Plus for about 6 months now, and it's become a core part of my morning routine. I take the mini capsule every morning while making my way through my inbox, whether I'm at home or I'm on the road, because it doesn't need to be refrigerated. And the capsule itself is delayed released, which helps it survive the harsh conditions of the upper GI tract for delivery to the colon, and that's exactly where we want it to go. Ritual invested in a study modeling the human colon, which showed that Symbiotic Plus significantly increased microbial diversity and the growth of beneficial bacteria. There's no more shame in your gut game. Symbiotic Plus and Ritual are here to celebrate, not hide your insides. Get 25% off your first month for a limited time at ritual.com/tilt. Start Ritual or add Symbiotic Plus to your subscription today. That's ritual.com/tilt for 25% off. During this month of planning and organization for big transitions, rhythms and routines have been absolutely essential for our physical and emotional well-being. So Green Chef nights are reliably and predictably a good night. We know the ingredients will be fresh and prepped, the instructions easy to follow, and the meal delicious. We're all still talking about last week's turkey tacos with mango chimichurri sauce, refried beans, and Monterey Jack cheese. Green Chef contributes to a healthy lifestyle with easy and delicious menus like fresh seasonal salads and grain bowls, and with over 80 weekly meal and market options, plus rotating options to suit a variety of lifestyles, whether Mediterranean, plant-based, calorie-smart, keto, protein-packed, gluten-free. There are always plenty of options to choose from. Whatever you select, you'll get farm-fresh ingredients, organic whole fruits and veggies, and premium proteins, all delivered straight to your door. I love those 4 words. Straight to my door. Oh, and one more thing I love about Green Chef, they have an app, which means it's easy to manage meal preferences and delivery from your phone if you want to. And I, for one, want to. I am in that mode where I'm making the most of little moments like waiting in line at the pharmacy or for the F train to pull into the station to tackle all of those to-dos. So the convenience of an app is key for me. Green Chef has a special offer for Tilt listeners. Go to greenchef.com/tilt50 and use code TILT50 to get 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months. That's 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months when you use the code TILT50 at greenchef.com/tilt50. Can you talk, just to connect the dots for me, why you talked about connecting the feelings to what's happening in a child's body and helping them recognize that, are your hands sweaty or are you feeling hot? Talk about why that's such an important thing to do.
So as parents, and it's not just parents it's the world. I mean, never mind we don't get an education in parenting. We don't have to pass any test to become a parent. We don't have to get any license. I have to renew my dog license every year, but I never got a license to be a parent. But also in our society, we rarely talk about feelings. I think in schools, they're doing a better job with social and emotional learning curricula, but it's not something I think comes naturally to most of us. And so we tend to deal with emotions in a variety of different ways, often depending on, who we are and how we've been brought up. So we certainly have parents who really talk about kids' feelings, but we also have parents who unknowingly, they say, there, don't worry, there's nothing to worry about. And the message that gives to kids is, my emotions aren't important signals, or they're things to be sort of brushed under the carpet. And what we know from the work of John Gottman and Lynn Katz and other really wonderful researchers, Nancy Eisenberg, is that when we as parents ignore, dismiss, or worse, punish emotions, when we say, don't cry, big boys don't cry, and those kinds of things, we send messages to kids that cause them to try and bury their emotions, and that puts them at higher risk for things like depression, feelings of depression and anxiety and things like that. So emotions are really important to pay attention to.
Yeah, I guess it just builds their emotional IQ, which is something, as you said, we all need.
For sure. So
in your book, you have these 3 questions that parents should ask themselves when they're looking to have a difficult conversation. I loved those, and as a way to kind of get more into some of the conversations. Could you walk us through those, thinking about what's happening right now with a lot of parents are wondering, how do I talk to my child about what's happening about George Floyd's murder, about what's happening with the protests around the United States? Could you maybe use that as an example as you walk us through these 3 questions?
So thanks, Debbie, for pointing that out. Really, I sort of suggest that parents ask themselves 3 questions before they have this essential conversation with their children. And you asked me to give the example of the horrendous killing of George Floyd. So the first question you want to ask yourself is, when's the best time to discuss this? And we don't always get an opportunity to choose the best time. But one of the things we need to think about is, when is a time for me to discuss this where I won't be distracted? And maybe even more important, I will be at my calmest. I will have had an opportunity to think this through myself first. So, often I'll suggest to parents, when's there a time after the rush of the day, maybe after dinner, you've cleared away the dishes, there's a little bit of a lull before bed, but it's not too much, but it's not right before bed, so that your child doesn't go to bed thinking about this, things like that. The second question is, how can I put my feelings aside to make this about my child's needs and not my own? And that really gets at what I was talking about before in terms of thinking about, what can I do to address my own concerns about this issue? So take some time, whether it's a walk, a few deep breaths, run yourself a bath, just take a little bit of time to reflect on how you yourself are feeling. And I find that when we have a chance to reflect on how we're feeling, even if we don't spend a long, long time on it, we're much more able to be in the moment and focus on our children rather than having our own preoccupied thoughts rushing through our heads. And then the third one is, what and how much information should I share with my child? And Debbie, we've been talking about kids of different ages, and of course, how old your child is and also who your child is going to determine this. So in general, the older your child is, the more they understand, the more they will likely have already heard, whether it's from media, from their phone, from other children. But think also about your child's needs. Is your child a more anxious child or a less anxious child? A child who can deal more with ambiguity or less with ambiguity? How engaged is your child? How much will your child care about this? And so those are all things that you might want to think about. So for example, with the murder of George Floyd, with a teenager, you would probably assume that your child's heard a lot, certainly by now. But teens really like to engage in and are able to engage in discussion about quite complicated issues. You are going to talk about discrimination and racism, maybe, and you're going to talk maybe about police brutality, and then alternatives. What are alternative ways with the votes? The vote that most recently came out of the Minneapolis City Council last night about dismantling the police department. What does all that mean? Protesting. What is peaceful protesting, and why are we seeing riots and looting and things like that? Those are all discussions you can have with a teen, but to have those kinds of discussions with your very young child runs the risk of really, disturbing them and also introducing ideas that they really can't understand. So, for example, a 5-year-old child doesn't understand that death is irreversible, which means that when people die, they're not coming back. That's a complicated concept, as any adult who's lost someone close to them and then has subsequently, seen them or done a double take in the street when they thought that they were sort of hearing the voice or seeing the person. It's a very difficult thing for us to understand. And so that's just one example of something that 3 to 5-year-olds really have a hard time understanding. So when you have a very young child, you want to really tailor your explanations for them to be very, very concrete. So it could be, for example, a bad thing happened and somebody got hurt when he wasn't doing anything wrong. And with a very young child, you want to really hear your child. I mean, with every age child, you want to hear concerns. But with a very young child, often kids just want to know whether they're going to be safe. And so helping them to understand how that relates to their own safety is very important. And in the book, actually, I have a conversation that was really guided by my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Bravada Garrett Akinsanya, of parents of African-American parents of an 8-year-old boy in a situation where a Black boy was, I believe, hurt by the police, and how they discussed that with their child in relation to their child's own worries about safety could provide some preliminary guidelines for parents.
Yeah, I appreciated that. That whole section, part 2 of your book, is essential conversations. And you've got chapters on talking about violence, talking about natural disasters and climate change, the perils of technology. You have a chapter talking about social justice, talking about our divided society. So you really do give some nice frameworks for conversations, including the example you just gave of having the talk, which I know is something that families of color have to have the talk with their kids, that white families don't necessarily have that same talk. And I think it's really helpful too for families with white kids to have a talk about the talk with their kids, right, so that white kids are aware of the plight of their friends who are Black and brown.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So can you talk with us about some of those other essential conversations that I just mentioned? I'm curious to know how you researched those, or how you kind of honed in on what you thought were the most important conversations that we need to have with our kids.
Right. I focus on 5 classes of what I call scary world events. And they really emerge from both my research. I've spent almost all my career studying children's exposure to violence and what parents can do to buffer children from these kinds of scary events. And in that chapter about violence, I talk a lot about violence in schools, but not only about violence in schools, also racial violence and prejudice against religious minorities. Obviously, lockdown drills have become a huge issue, and it's terrifying. And I've spent a lot of time talking with school personnel about lockdown drills. And actually, in my first meeting with my editor, she told me that they had just received, their son was a kindergartner, and they had just received an email the day before from the school telling the parents that the first lockdown drill was going to be held the next day. And the editor said to me, "What do I tell my child?" And that became the basis for the conversation about lockdown drills. So in addition to violence, of course, climate change has become a huge topic of concern for parents, for everybody, really. And so I talk about some examples related to climate change, both in terms of climate change as sometimes a hot button topic of discussion for teens, for example, and for people of different political persuasions, but also the very harsh reality of the huge increase in extreme weather events here in the United States, whether that's fires or tornadoes or severe storms, things like that. Then there's the issue of social media, and and even when my oldest were young, have we ever been exposed to such intense 24/7 news coverage? And the fact that now, and I'm sure it's younger than 10, but at least at last look, the average age at which an American child got a cell phone was 10 years old. And something like, a huge minority of 9-year-olds have cell phones. And so kids are seeing things on their cell phones, from, weather warnings to Amber Alerts that may or may not be during the school day, or certainly if their schools are locking away their cell phones to and from the school on the bus, or even after school in their bedrooms, that parents don't have a chance to filter, at least at first glance. But also we're seeing more and more horrendous incidents of things like social media bullying. And as parents, whereas we can monitor our children's activities when we can see them, we often do not see what happens online or on social media, certainly in instances like Snapchat, where the messages disappear really quickly. So that was the rationale for the social media chapter. And then social justice, I think it's pretty self-evident, sadly, now in this era of the murder of George Floyd. But divided society, I think, over the last, 10 years or so, but certainly intensely over the last 5 years, we have seen such divisions in society, such hot issues, people not being able to sit around the Thanksgiving table and talk about much because of the divisions even within families around issues like immigration, other political issues like climate, things like that. So that was the rationale.
We'll be right back after this quick break. Hey there, it's Debbie. I love making this show and sharing conversations about how to support our awesome neurodivergent kids. I've seen how even one little insight from an interview can spark a big shift in daily life. But I know that raising complex kids can be messy and lonely. And just when we think we figured it out, something comes up that boots us right back to feeling overwhelmed and stuck. That's why I've poured everything into creating a way for parents like us navigating complex parenting journeys to join together and chart a path that feels positive, hopeful, and doable. It's the brand new Differently Wired Club experience. In the club, you'll get personal support from me and other seasoned parent coaches, 6 live calls every month where you can connect and get your personal questions answered, the opportunity to learn directly from authors and experts like I have on this show, monthly themes for getting specific and tactical, an exclusive private podcast feed, and the best, most generous community of parents. Seriously, these folks show up for themselves and each other, and that right there is really everything. Because it's a daily reminder that we're not alone. Our kids aren't broken, and we have totally got this. The recently rebooted Differently Wired Club is on a brand new platform with its very own iOS and Android app. It is such a great space. However you learn, whatever your style, no matter the ages, genders, and neurodivergent profile of your children, the Differently Wired Club can help you cultivate the positive shifts you're hoping for. Join us today by going to tiltparenting.com/club. That's tiltparenting.com/club. I hope to see you on the inside.
Are you overwhelmed by the things that get in the way of you doing what you want to do? Are you looking for ways to simplify life to better align with your values? Do you want to create space in your schedule so you have room for more of the good stuff? Play, joy, relationships, gratitude, and more? If you answered yes to any of these questions, I invite you to check out Edit Your Life, a podcast to help you edit the unnecessary from your life so you have more room to enjoy the awesome. Through episodes with me, Christine Coe, and a range of super smart, compassionate, and thoughtful guests, you'll come away with big picture insights and practical ways to declutter your home, schedule, and mental space without getting bogged down by perfection. I have always believed that small moments and actions matter tremendously. My goal is to help you find agency and space in your life through doable baby steps that will leave you feeling accomplished instead of overwhelmed. Check out Edit Your Life wherever you enjoy your podcasts.
I mean, it's very thorough. Again, I just appreciated the range of conversations that you have in there and that you share a full conversation, that's how I learn, is by really observing and seeing how this might play out. So I just really appreciated the language, and it was kind of like eavesdropping on some conversations, but it's just great tools and language that I think all parents could use and just get us thinking about, okay, how can I be more prepared for when this comes up and be more proactive?
Well, that was really the goal, Debbie, to give parents a full script. But I think, and I hope that parents won't take it to heart, that this is supposed to be a play-by-play, a word-by-word script, not at all. I mean, the idea for the full scripts was simply to give examples that apply principles for parents, rather than parents feeling that they're going to fall down if they can't do it exactly as it's written. So hopefully the intent it comes across that the goal here is to apply principles rather than a word for word.
Right. So I want to ask one more question. I'm just wondering, what do parents often get wrong when talking about these things? Are there things that you've seen, common mistakes that parents make when looking to discuss sensitive or difficult topics?
That is such a great question. The two mistakes that parents most frequently make, and I'm a parent too, are really driven by our desire to protect our young, which is sort of what we all have to do, right? But what that translates into especially when we feel passionate or worried ourselves or preoccupied with an issue, whether it's we saw a post or a picture of our child on Instagram that we worry in 10 years' time when he or she wants to become a politician will bring them down, or whether we are just so distraught by something that's happening, or we're so sad about our own child's distress about something that happened to them with friends or in school, that what we do is we get caught up. And our distress at our child's distress or our own distress at what's happening in the world completely clouds our ability to do what ultimately, if we were able to take a step back, we would value as the right thing to do. So I think these are unintentional mistakes that parents make, and I give a lot of examples in the book. And believe me, I've been guilty of them as well. And I think what happens is where, my dear colleague used to say, families are the crucibles for strong emotion. And what happens is there's no place other than our family where our emotions get so caught up. And sometimes it's so hard to just step away or just recognize it before we say the very thing that we didn't mean to say.
Well, I imagine that just like when we screw up with our kids, that we can go back and repair, that we can do the same thing, right? Just if we've said it wrong one time, we always can go back and have a do-over and re-engage in that conversation in a different way.
Thank goodness for that, right?
Yeah.
Thank goodness. And yes, I think your message implicit, and I hope it's implicit in the book as well, is forgiveness, right? Let's not be perfect. Let's also instill in both ourselves, and I talk about gratitude, but I think that's also related to the ability for us and our children to forgive each other.
Yeah. Such an important lesson right now. So before we say goodbye, I would love if you could share where people can reach you, where they can learn more about your book. And then if there's, I'm just putting you on the spot, is there kind of one last takeaway, one thing you really hope people listening to this podcast will leave with?
Thank you, Debbie. So first of all, people can reach me on my website, which is www.abigailgewirtz.com. I'll spell it because it's hard. ABIGAILGEWIRTZ, or one word, .com. And you can also find the sample conversation about coronavirus there. I think if there's one last nugget I'd want parents to think about, it is what messages about the world and about the things that are going on now are messages that you want your child to take in. And when you think about that, that will set you on the path to being more intentional about the kinds of conversations you have, and go have those conversations more and more and more, or over and over again, and try and have one a day. And don't feel that you have to predetermine the topic, and don't feel that you have to set the time. Follow your child, pick up on what they're saying, and grab that as your opportunity.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And listeners, I will have links to Abigail's book on the website, When the World Feels Like a Scary Place, Essential Conversations for Anxious Parents and Worried Kids. It's really wonderful. And again, just so needed right now. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share with us today and have this conversation.
Thank you, Debbie. It's really been a pleasure.
You've been listening to the Tilt Parenting Podcast. For the show notes for this episode, visit tiltparenting.com/podcast and search for this conversation. If you like what you heard on today's episode, I would be grateful if you could take a minute to head over to Apple Podcasts and leave a rating or a review. Thank you so much for helping us stay visible so people who would benefit from the show can easily find it. If you want to support the show and help me cover the cost of production, please consider joining my Patreon campaign. To support the show, just visit patreon.com/tiltparenting. Lastly, if you aren't already part of the online community at Tilt, I invite you to sign up at tiltparenting.com on the box in the bottom where it says Join the Revolution. Every Thursday, I send out a short email with a quick note from me, a link to that week's podcast episode, and links to 5 stories from the news that week that are relevant to parents like us. Again, you can sign up and learn more about Tilt at www.tiltparenting.com.
If you're a parent, I invite you to join us at the Mindful Mama podcast, where it's all about becoming a less irritable, more joyful parent. With sometimes hilarious and always thought-provoking experts and friends, at Mindful Mama, we know that you cannot give what you do not have. And when you have calm and peace within, then you can give it to your children. I'm Hunter Clark Fields, and I can't wait to see you there. Listen in to the Mindful Mama podcast.